Hello, Year 12. This is the assessment lesson that should have turned up last week, but for a whole host of reasons didn't. And also I noticed that I've been putting out lessons faster than you could achieve them. So hopefully this will fix that by knocking things back a lesson, but also keeping things on track, if that makes sense. Today's lesson is assessment. We've done the first bit of the first chapter, and that is the modernization theory. I guess we now need to check whether any of it's stuck. At the same time, we need to look at the new structure for assessments and for questions. Now, you'll be happy to know there's not a lot of difference. I'll explain in a moment. So if I go straight to the questions, if I get the right questions up, there we go. Now it's a Word file, so I apologize. Unlike usually where I've got a PowerPoint with a lovely little PowerPoint slide, this is a Word file, so it carries with it all the usual problems you'd expect with such a thing. So if I get rid of that, there we go. And now you can see the two questions that I'm asking you to do. They are both worth 10 marks. The old 2-2-6 structure is gone. So the first 10 marks are now all one question. Now, if you notice from the question you have here, it simply asks you to outline and explain two ways in which sociologists use modernization theory to explain development. In other words, it's exactly the same as the 10 markers that you're used to. It's the second 10 marks that would have been in the families and households section. That is, free choice, use whatever you like, come up with two ways in which sociologists use modernization theory to explain development. Now, as much as I write modernization theory with a capital and a Z, because I'm me, you'll see that the exam board write it without a capital and an S. Both of them are perfectly fine. The one in the exam is probably the one to go with if you're struggling. That's question 16, and the mark scheme is exactly the same as you're used to. Level 1 is identifying valid points or identifying valid examples. Level 2 is making a valid point that is explained or a valid point that is illustrated with an example, and you get up to the top end if you do that twice. Level 3, which is worth 8 to 10 marks, which is what you should be aiming for, is where you give two examples and each of them are illustrated with a specific example and they are explained in relation to the question. In this particular instance, you could talk about the 5 stages, that's perfectly acceptable. You could talk about culture, that's perfectly acceptable. And you could talk about the economic measurements that they use in modernization theory to explain development. So why is it some countries are developed and other countries are not? That's all it's asking. If you look back over your notes, you will see that there are several headings you could use and that they fit reasonably well under this sort of overall question. They'll fit reasonably well. You only need 2. And it's a free choice. You can pick whatever works for you. The next question is something a little bit different. Like the essay question, the 20 marker that you've been doing for families and households, this carries with it an item, but it's only 10 marks. It will always appear second. It will always be question 17. It will always, by the way, be item K. This particular item I've made up myself, but the format follows a similar pattern every time. They will give you hints at the 2 points they want you to use. And the mark scheme states that you must use the item at some point. What does this mean? It means that at least one of the points that you bring up need to be drawn from the item they give you. Ideally, both points. And that way you're more likely to slip into the top levels. Other than that, the mark scheme is exactly the same, except that you get extra marks, or you get credit, I should say, for evaluation. That is attacking the item or putting it in context or weighing it up with other points that you know from your own knowledge. You don't get any extra marks or any credit in question 16 for evaluation. Doesn't mean you can't do it, it just means you don't get credit for it. There's nothing in the mark scheme saying you have to do it. It's good practice though, and it's the whole peel with the extra E in it, or peely if you prefer. The point, evidence, explain, link to the question, and sometimes explain and link to the question are the same thing. They flow on from one another. To explain properly, you've got to link to the question, and to link to the question, you've kind of got to explain what you're doing, and then evaluate, give another point of view, weigh it up somehow. Like you were doing in the essays last year, there's nothing different here. It's the same technique. There's a reason we taught it the way we did. Do that twice and you win. In question 17, you've got to use the item now. So at least one of your points, or one of your examples, or one of your explanations must be drawn from the item. The item should set up at least 2, sometimes more. My item is a little too long. I haven't quite mastered the art of being as pointed as they are in the exams. Nevertheless, it does do the job and it does show exactly what you need to do. So the item in this particular instance says, many neoliberal sociologists argue that education in LEDCs leads to the creation of an educated elite that prevents access to the upper echelons of society for those not as educated. Education, therefore, can increase existing divisions and worsen the overall economic situation. Now, you should have a name on the tip of your brain at this point. I shan't ruin it and tell you what that name is, but you should know. And you should also have a school of thought or a school of sociologists that should be just desperate to explode from your mouth and out into the air in front of you. You should know whose view this is. The item does not tell you. Therefore, when you draw it, it becomes your own knowledge. And when you explain it, you are drawing it from the item. That's how it works. The next paragraph sets up the second point. Furthermore, some sociologists argue that modernization theory takes the supremacy of Western values for granted and suffers from being ethnocentric. Now, there are 4 aspects that we have learned. All of them are equally valid to answer this question. You do not need all 4. Just one will do. It cannot accurately explain the issues facing developing countries because it does not take into account different models of development. There is a hint about which one the examiner, in this case me, wants you to use. You don't have to follow that hint. They said ethnocentrism. You get to deploy any of those 4 points that you know to answer this question. Now, these 2 10 markers shouldn't be too taxing. In an exam situation, you would be expected to do them in half the time you have available. Between them, therefore, you'd have half an hour or 15 minutes per question. However, this is the first time you've done them, and it's the first time using the new knowledge that you have. I would not expect you, therefore, to complete these in timed conditions. That would be ridiculous. Rather, you should take a little bit longer over these and check your answers. And be honest with yourselves. Check what you need to know, go back over the notes, and if necessary, return to the videos that I've recorded for you. They're recorded. You can go back as many times as you like. One of the great advantages of lockdown is that it's forced me to record my spiel, and therefore you have a permanent record that you can refer to. Now, I will expect you to submit these for my marking. You'll have to excuse me. You haven't had a break, but I have. I think I was saying you're going to have to submit to this, but I don't know whether I got round to where. So the point is, you go through both questions. In an exam, they would take you half an hour to complete, so 15 minutes per question. However, you are not in an exam. I've told you to take longer. Go back and reuse previous videos. Hopefully this video has given you the technique that you need. In case you can't remember, it's 2 paragraphs for each 10-mark question. Each paragraph tackles a PEELY structure, or PEEL if you prefer, and that is point, evidence, explain and link, which, as I said, was often the same thing, and then evaluate. You don't get credit for evaluation in the first question, question 16, but you do get credit for evaluation in question 17, and you will get credit for evaluation in an essay. As a consequence, it's a good idea just to get into the habit of doing it without really thinking about it. Always evaluate, in other words. It's never going to do you wrong. You're never going to waste your time. Hopefully that's good enough for you. Hopefully that's explained things. Now, I make it you've got around about 45 minutes left of this particular lesson. You could, if you wish, try to write both answers in 45 minutes. I would expect them submitted, and of course you can type them, which is perfectly acceptable, and then attach them in the normal way. Or if you prefer, do them by hand. I don't usually say this, and the reason is at school we have access to plenty of computers, and it just makes things easier in case it gets lost or in case I don't get it back to you properly. And it's a fail-safe. It's always been a fail-safe. Given the situation, I think this is the first time I've asked you to submit anything in sociology. So given the situation and the fact that, well, we're in unprecedented times. It makes perfect sense. If you handwrite it, you can take a picture and attach it that way, or scan it if you're lucky enough to have a scanner. If you don't, just take a picture. You can do it on a smartphone and attach it even from the smartphone. Now, provided that that's at a high enough resolution, and most smartphones are these days, I should be able to read that. So because we've got that backup and fail-safe of a scanned or photographed copy, and therefore you can keep the original, I don't mind you submitting something that is handwritten. It makes perfect sense in the situation. So please take a picture, attach that, or type it if you must. I mean, typing allows you to edit as you go, and therefore you can redraft, whereas if you do it by hand, no one's rewriting that. Well, I understand that, and you understand that. Once you've written something, it's written. It is done. If you make mistakes, they kind of stay there forever. And so the idea is, as you're still learning, ideally, you'd redraft, but maybe you prefer writing by hand. And if you want to redraft and write by hand, feel free. I think that's quite enough explanation from me now, and you're probably getting bored of it. So if you have been, thank you for watching. Have a lovely day, Year 12. I will see you, or rather you'll see me on Thursday with the, oh sorry, Friday. I do apologize, I can do my days of the week. Friday with the next lesson, which will be beginning the next of the big theories, the dependency theory, and I shall look forward to it. In the meantime, have a lovely day, and I'll see you on the flip side. I may be in school next week, so this week. Some of you have already been back today, and I'll see you anon. Thank you very much. Awkward pause ending.